form of government I want to talk about a lot today is this sort of muddy middle category called electoral authoritarianism, sometimes called competitive authoritarianism. These are countries where there are elections and parties that oppose the government, but the ruling party and the leader, which we would refer to as a dictator, is using the powers of the government to have an unfair advantage over the electoral process. So people vote, other parties run and even campaign, but the electoral playing field is so tilted and imbalanced, be it gerrymandering or coercion, intimidation, control of the press, propaganda, that the elections are really not free and fair in a meaningful way. And so these systems are often the product of backsliding once healthy democracies become captured by authoritarian political figures working through the democratic institutions. And we see this kind of distortion of democracy and a kind of collapse towards electoral autocracy. So that is the process at a very abstract level that political scientists and many American citizens are now worried is unfolding currently in the United States. Is the US backsliding towards some form of authoritarian government? I should say I don't love the word backsliding because it implies moving backward. And for a country like the US, which does not have a strong authoritarian political tradition, it doesn't quite make sense to people. What are we sliding back towards? And also sounds like slip and slide, which is fun. Backsliding is not fun. So I often use the phrase democratic erosion or breakdown, which I think is more understandable for people. So factors that increase backsliding. What do we know about what makes countries vulnerable to this? One thing I do want to emphasize to you all is that there is no one story. There's no one size fits all solution. Backsliding looks different in every single country, and governments do different things, use different tools, and it takes different forms everywhere. So when people draw historical parallels, for example, to fascist regimes like in Italy or Nazi Germany, those are fine. These are examples of backsliding, but it's important to remember that nobody thinks we're headed down the path of Nazi Germany. So it's always important to remember the unique nature of each case and our own political circumstance. But nevertheless, there are a few things that we think generally make countries more vulnerable to this political process, and I will highlight a few of them. The first is polarization, whether it's partisan or sometimes racial and ethnic polarization. Partisan polarization is simply the degree to which people loathe the other side. So can we coexist with people from the other political parties, or do we see them as competitors, or do we see them as enemies? And the reason why this matters for backsliding is because democracy, we often think about democracy as a repeated game that political parties and politicians agree to play indefinitely, right? And so the idea is that, okay, I'm going to run for election. If I lose, I will give up power, knowing that when I'm not in power, you're not going to throw me in jail. I can stomach your policies, and I will have a chance to compete again in 4 years or 2 years or wherever the next election is. What polarization does is it basically raises the stakes of the game. And when the stakes of the game get high, people have an incentive to cheat. They have an incentive to try to change the rules or just not even honor the results of an election at all. And so polarization creates a political incentive to erode democracy and seize power, full stop. And we can talk about what that looks like in the US. Relatedly, we know that inequality is bad for democracy. Inequality, we typically think in political science, when a country gets highly unequal, it creates a class of people, the hyper wealthy, that have an incentive often to fight against democracy. This is not uniformly true, and there are plenty of very wealthy people who are very pro-democracy. But in general, when people are highly wealthy, they fear democracy because democracy empowers the common person, which, if done right, would entail a high degree of redistribution of wealth from the hyper wealthy down to the middle class and the poor. And so high levels of inequality create an incentive to engage in authoritarian behavior, especially among the hyper rich. We get kind of a grievance politics from the working class that can be used to justify authoritarian moves as well. So inequality is not good for democracy. Sue Stokes, who's a legendary political scientist and has a new book on backsliding, she's joining the forum in a few weeks. She has a new book coming out on this, and she gave a talk at Princeton a few months ago, and she had a nice sentence, which I'm going to butcher, which was basically like, investing in reducing inequality is like investing in democracy itself. And so I think that's one thing to think about. The other couple of factors, and then I'll move on, is an authoritarian political tradition, right? So a lot of times we observe backsliding when countries are just newly institutionalized democracies. Democracy is like a plant. It needs to take root, and politicians need to understand power one to one another. It needs to become commonplace and normal for a country to go between different governments. And the longer the democratic tradition is, the deeper those roots take hold, and civil society grows, media grows, all the kind of ancillary institutions and societal checks and balances start to take hold. And that is a huge stabilizing force. A lot of times we see backsliding. We see a lot of it, for example, in Latin America, which has a history of military dictatorships and coups. We see a lot of it in post-communist countries, which are obviously coming out of the Soviet Union and that political experience. And so countries that have a long tradition of democracy tend to fare better. And then the final factor I would raise is national security threats. Basically, any government can manufacture a national security threat if they want. But what I'm talking about here is countries that are faced with war or the prospect of war, countries that are faced with some internal instability, whether it's a migrant population or some population inside that is creating instability or creating the perception of instability. Authoritarian governments or backsliding leaders feed on threats and national security threats to justify authoritarian turns in their countries. And so that's another key ingredient in this mix. I'm going to close because I see so many good questions and I've just been blabbing and I would love to interact with you more. But just this big question of, can it happen here? The answer is yes, right? We have a long tradition of democracy, but we have some of these other factors in our society now that are really concerning. And I will go through a few. So partisan polarization, this is probably not news to you all, but partisan polarization in the United States is extraordinarily high. And it's been high for about a decade now, a little bit longer than that. This is data from the ANES, which is a public opinion survey that's used by political scientists. The cool thing about it is it's been asking the same questions for decades, so we can compare different periods of time. Polarization is the way we measure in our field is the difference between how you feel about your own party and how you feel about the other party. So if you hate your own party and the other party, you're actually not that polarized. You just hate everybody. But if you really love your party and really loathe the other one, you're highly polarized. And so we've seen polarization increase over time, in particular, that kind of out-group loathing. The feelings toward the rival party have really increased in recent years. And that predated Trump. It was increasing under Obama and under Bush as well. But we have high degree of polarization. The other thing that's working against us is we have extraordinarily high levels of inequality in this country. There's so much data on this. This is data from Piketty and Saez, which look at the income share of the top 10%. The top 10% of people in the United States, goes back to 2012, it's increased since then, have over 50% of the income in this country, which is not healthy. It creates incentives for authoritarianism among the hyper elite. It also creates kind of resentment politics that can be activated by a kind of a demagogue like Trump. And so the inequality is concerning and bad for our democracy. And then the national security threats, this country, there's many threats being activated at the same time, right? There's the China threat, there's the immigrant crime threat, there's the terrorism threat from the Middle East, Palestine, Iran, all you name it. They're all kind of intertwining. And again, these create a pretext for engaging in power grabs and other forms of intimidation. I'm actually quite optimistic, despite the tone of this first part of this. And the reason why I'm optimistic is this third one. It's the democratic tradition. This isn't Hungary. This isn't Brazil. This isn't Turkey. And that's not to denigrate those societies and those countries. But there is something unique about the United States. We have a deep, deep democratic tradition. And I've been really heartened and inspired by the level of activism in this country. And it is significant. People say, oh, do all these protests mean anything? Yes, they do. Protests normalize opposition. They create conversations at dinner tables and in hometowns, and they generate a popular consciousness about what is going on. The language of authoritarianism is now mainstream. I'm not the only person saying Trump is authoritarian. Millions of people are saying that. And that is significant. The No Kings protest, according to data from Elliot Morris, who used to run 538, I think had roughly 1.5 to 2.5% of the population. I have to fact check this, but I think it's about 2% of the population participated on a protest on that day. That is an unbelievable number. It would mark it as the second largest protest in American history. So that is significant. And there's other data on this as well. This is, again, data from Elliott, and we see the number of protests over time comparing the Trump administration term 1 to term 2. People are out in the streets a lot more in term 2 than they were in term 1, and that does matter.